Hello everyone, welcome to Assyrian Timescast. My name is Ashur Ashana, coming to you from the British Museum. We are honored to have Dr. Irving Finkel as our guest. How are you, Doctor?
I'm delighted to be with you.
Thank you so much. Can you tell us more about yourself, sir?
Well, I'm a curator in the British Museum in the department called the Middle East, which covers the whole of the Middle East in the normal sense, but right back into early times and up to the modern world. So it's a big span of human history. And I'm a specialist in that department for the languages and the writing of ancient Iraq, the Sumerian and Babylonian languages, written on clay tablets, of which we have rather a large number, which arrived in the 19th century. And I studied at university. I learned with a very brilliant professor how to read and understand cuneiform writing and the Sumerian and Babylonian languages. And then in 1979, I was very fortunate to get a job here as a curator. So I've been here for almost all of my adult life.
Wow. You studied cuneiform so deeply. Have you ever discovered any clay that make us look at history in a different way?
That's an important and interesting question, because people have ideas about the ancient world which come from books, and sometimes they're from old books that get repeated and repeated and repeated, and then after a while people think everything is known.
That's right.
So this is a danger, especially for students at university. But in fact, when you have a situation with a really large amount of inscriptions, some very large, some very small, covering 3,000 years of time, it means that when it's possible to read these inscriptions and understand them, all sorts of things come out that you wouldn't expect, you wouldn't anticipate, and sometimes contradict what people have always assumed. So I've had a very privileged career in this sense, because I've had the keys to unlock the cupboards where all these treasures, 3,000 years of clay tablets, are stored. And you can make two kinds of really marvelous discovery. Some are small discoveries. So, for example, there might be a king, everybody thought he reigned for 22 years, something like that. And then all of a sudden you find another bit of stuff, and you realize, no, he reigned for 26 years. So then all the people who study dates, they have to think they have to move them up and move them back and incorporate this new information and expand their understanding. So this is a sort of small, in the global sense, discovery. And another thing, because these languages are dead languages, even though they have been studied a great deal, there are words on the ancient documents which are not in our modern dictionaries. So sometimes when you find an ancient inscription and you read it, goodness me, you realize this word has never been seen before, but it's a real word. I'll give you an example. Because in the story of the flood, the ancient Babylonian flood, they built, in order to save life and the animals and the people who were supposed to survive, they built a giant coracle, a coracle. And the round boat that you see still sometimes on the rivers of the world, and Iraq too. Well, the thing was, in the Arabic language, the coracle is called a guffa. So for an Iraqi person, a guffa is an unknown word. And in the story, in the Babylonian, there was the word kupu. And kupu, in the dictionary, there wasn't a word kupu that could possibly be the right meaning for the context. And then I realized that the word kupu in Assyrian, from the time of the second millennium, in fact, BC, Old Babylonian word, kupu, must be cognate, related to the Arabic guffa. And so the modern living word in Arabic opens up a new word in the past. So in the dictionary where the word kupu is written, it is now, we understand, what it really means. So that's also an exciting thing. And then sometimes there are rather big things which have consequences. The biggest one for me probably was that there was a board game played in Iraq by the Sumerians and the Babylonians. And
was it a king board game? Used to call
yes.
it? A royal game?
It's sometimes called the Royal Game of Ur.
Royal Game of
because the board was first discovered at the city of Ur in southern Iraq. And it came to light by the archaeologists in royal graves. The queen and the princess and other people had examples of this game because they liked it. And they thought in the world to come, they would also want to play with cups of tea with their nieces and nephews. And so they had them in the grave. And these boards existed with their dice and the pieces. And then a cuneiform tablet in the museum, which was written a very long time afterwards. So the boards were from about 2500 BC, something like that. And this tablet with rules on was written in the 2nd century BC. So a huge period of time afterwards, which showed that the game had been played for a very long time and played on the street and in bars when people were drinking and in houses and so forth. But at the end of the first millennium, there were some scholars who were astronomers. And they knew about the movements of the stars, and they knew about the zodiac, and they knew about many complicated things. And they had their traditional game that kids and adults have played for 2,500 years.
Okay.
And they made up a special complicated game using the idea of the zodiac and the movement of the planets. Much more complicated than most people could understand. And this came out of one of these tablets, so the whole history of this thing suddenly was there on the table.
Is there any evidence on tablets, like they explain how they were so good in astronomy, like seeing the sky and the stars?
There's a great deal of information about astronomy, and it's mostly from the first millennium BC. And there's an important thing about it, which makes it explicable why the scholars and the astronomers in Mesopotamia made so many clever observations and calculations. Because in antiquity, in Iraq, there was no pollution in the air, in the sky, in the night sky. So a normal Babylonian person, when they went to sleep on the roof when it was so hot, they lay back and they looked up at the sky.
And it was all clear.
And it was like a drive-in movie. And I believe that all intelligent people in ancient Mesopotamia knew all about the stars in the sky because they saw them every day. And what happened was that in antiquity, like in the modern world, you have very stupid people. And you have people who are okay and people who are rather clever. And you have geniuses all across. This must have been true all the way through history. And there were people in Babylonia who were really very, very intelligent indeed. And you can imagine, if you're looking up at this marvelous view and you think, now there's a funny thing, I'm sure that used to be over there.
Yeah.
What's it doing over here? Like that. And all you have to do in the history of science is to have one clever person to see that and then to think, how can that be? How can that be? And they understood, they worked out using mathematical astronomy, the most amazing amount of information about what they could, to explain what they could see with their own eyes. And so it became a big component, some of which passed into the knowledge of the Greeks and informed Greek astronomy and Greek mathematical astronomy, and in fact is still a kind of alive in the world.
Were these discovered in Ashurbanipal's library, like most of these tablets?
Well, a lot of what we know about what the Mesopotamians understood, what was traditional, what they regarded as important, comes from the Library of Ashurbanipal, who was this very famous, brilliant, politically clever, military and intelligent trained intellectual who was the king of Assyria in the 7th century. So he was king of the world, and he had money and power and armies and administrators. But when he was a boy, something fortunate had happened to him, because he had a tutor called Balassi. And Balassi was one of these geniuses who was an astronomer, who understood about the movements of the planets and the stars. He understood everything.
Okay.
And he taught Ashurbanipal as a boy to read and write cuneiform, because he was one of the princes and he was going to be king one day, and he would have to be able to read cuneiform and speak properly his own language. So he had this best tutor possible, and he grew up with a deep interest in learning, in words, in meaning, in literature, all those things of an intellectual interest. And because he was such a powerful ruler, he used his position in order to bring tablets, documents to the library, sometimes from down south in Babylonia, in southern Iraq, things from old libraries that they didn't have in Nineveh, and the tablets would come to the capital, and there was a whole chancery, a whole room of top scribes, and when a tablet came in, they would copy it out in the king's beautiful writing for the library, make sure everything was perfect, and they had a kind of system. And sometimes he sent a letter saying, look, we need this, we don't have that, can you find it? And his agents went to what you would think of as university libraries in our world, that's to say temple libraries, or the libraries of great scholars, private individuals who were teachers and thinkers. And they brought to Nineveh, for the king's library, what was needed. So in the end, he had a library of maybe 25,000 tablets that covered knowledge then, the knowledge of the world then. That was the idea, with the best quality manuscripts, and they had lists of words, lists of numbers, calculations, observations of the heavens, taking omens. They had poetry, they had literature, they had love songs, they had and historical things and administrative things and correspondence, all together in this great compilation, which was at the time probably the first library ever meant to be with everything under a single roof. That was the kind of conception. And it's easy to have an idea like that. And if you're king of Assyria, you can do that. You just tell people to do this and do that. And he obviously paid a lot of attention to the documents himself, because he wasn't like a collector who had them and left them on the shelf. He obviously read them and he checked them, and they signed at the bottom, they belong to the library, no one must take them away. So he was very involved in that.
How many tablets were discovered in the library?
Well, that's also a good question, because when they were discovered, some were complete and some of them are big. We'll look in a moment. Some big ones, some smaller ones, and many of them were broken, some into very, very small pieces indeed. And when they excavated, they brought everything that they could find back. So we have a situation that maybe there are 30,000 bits of tablets from the Nineveh library. But gradually, the scholars, the students who work on this, they find a piece and they realize it goes here and they join it together. And then there's another piece one day comes and joins it together. And sooner or later, it becomes possible to create a tablet from rejoined pieces, which otherwise are pretty useless. You have a fragment with a few words on, that's nothing. But when there's a systematic collection of information and you join them together, then suddenly you have the story of Gilgamesh or the story of Inanna going in the underworld, almost complete. So the number of tablets, say they brought back 30,000. Every month the number gets smaller because
the pieces comes together.
Yes. So it's a funny situation. But what we don't know is whether the pieces that we have were the whole of the original library or only part of it. I believe it was only part of it. So probably at Nineveh, in the ground, there's going to be more to be discovered.
So there's more to be discovered.
There's always more to be discovered. That is the rule.
Were there any contracts, like contracts for sale, contract for marriages?
There were many contracts because they were, especially the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they were very orderly about their lives. Things had to be done properly. And if you wanted to buy or sell a piece of land, for example, you got the people involved, your family and the other family, everybody sat around, they drank coffee.
Like witnesses and
the witnesses.
Wow.
And so a scribe would be there and he would draw up the contract to make sure it was correct, then he would write it out perfectly, the size of the land, the measurements, what was here, what was there, all around it. And then the witnesses would, their names would be there, Mr. So-and-so, Ibn Mr. So-and-so, like that. And then they roll their seals on the edge for proof of it. And it will be a legal binding contract, which, if there was ever going to be a dispute, could be produced. And there were disputes because they had courts and magistrates, and they had constables who could go and take people to the court. And they had this idea that there was a way of doing things and it had to be done that way. So there were contracts about purchasing, about hiring people, about adoption, about marriage, all the main things in people's lives. There was a precedent which they could use to draw up a satisfactory legal matter. So a modern lawyer, for example, if he had one of these translated into English or Arabic and read it through as if the clients were in front of him, as if they were, then he would know what he would see across the time of millennia, thousands of years, that it was done by somebody like him with the same idea to make sure everything was done properly.
Doctor, why did the Assyrian Empire lasted so long?
Well, it lasted quite a long time, but it was a bit up and down.
Like there was periods, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
but they had a sequence of very effective, powerful kings who were in control of the country, in control of the army, and who were driven by the need for raw materials which didn't exist in Iraq to go and get it. So they had military policies where they conquered territory in order to get gold, wood, any number of resources which they needed at home in Assyria. And when they had successfully done this, they put a high official in this place to be the governor, and he answered to Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. There was correspondence that went between, messengers that went between, and the powerful kings, driven by the desire for territory and possessions and slaves and everything else, when they conquered, they imposed their writing system as much as they could, their administration, and Nineveh was the center of an empire in the sense like a modern empire, that one understands the term. The success of the Assyrians as war makers, as conquerors, is they had a very efficient army with the most up-to-date weapons, the fastest chariots, the most lethal bows. They had armorers who made weapons, and when in the Middle East a style of weapon evolved to be more suitable, the Assyrians for sure had that in their army. They were state of the art. They even had, you can see on some of the reliefs, they even had a kind of battering ram mounted on a tank, so that when they laid siege, they'd push it up the slope, and the great pole with an iron end against the door of the entrance, and bash it and bash it and bash it. Wow. And it's to give you an idea of the sophistication of it, the long pole, which was the offensive thing out the front, must have been made of wood. And there's a scene on one of the sculptures of people under the siege throwing burning pitch down onto this wood to try and set fire to it so it couldn't bash through the door. And there's somebody in the tank with water putting out the fire so it could work properly. So when you look at it, it's a state-of-the-art war machine. It's the most effective thing that had ever been invented. I mean, to a modern eye, to a modern general, it looks like a child's toy. But if you were hemmed up in your palace and you knew the Assyrians were coming and you heard these wheels rumbling along, and you'd be half dead already. Yes.
Wow. Why did they have lamassos at the gates, at the entry of the gates?
Yes, the lamassos are one of the things that when people go to a museum, they remember afterwards because they're so huge, especially for children. So they are bulls, they are human-headed bulls with long beards and wings, and they are they're on guard, they are protective, and you have a pair of them, one each side, left and right, and then on top of their heads, a huge arch was built. So it was a very important ceremonial doorway. And these lamassos they encouraged the success, you could say, of the country on many levels.
Which artifact fascinated you the most from Nineveh?
From Nineveh, gosh. Well, one of the things is, in terms of writing, is the tablets, I think, are very beautiful because there are cuneiform tablets long before the Assyrian library, and there are many long afterwards. So it's just a period in the 3,000 years in which cuneiform was used. But the king, who, as I said, was involved with this library, I think he had a particular taste for a certain kind of writing, a kind of calligraphy, you might say, as people talk about Arabic calligraphy or Roman calligraphy. And the guys who worked for him in the library, they were calligraphers. So they wrote the most beautiful script. And they also used the best possible clay, because clay to make pots is one thing, and sometimes they have stones in and stuff like that. But they knew where, by the river, you could get this beautiful clay that would be perfect. So the objects themselves, when they are well preserved, are very, very beautiful. And I find it interesting that it's what you might call an aesthetic comes of them. Things are broken in archaeology. You have a plan and you have a thing on the floor, and imagine, if you will, there was a building, and imagine furniture and so forth. You can do this in your mind. But the thing is, the bits that we have from the Nineveh capital centre, from the palace area, not only the documents but the objects as well, were obviously of a very high, luxurious, high quality lifestyle that anybody would recognize if they went there. The pottery and ivories and all these things with a very high aesthetic, and you can tell from it something of the eye of the king and his view of the world.
Which period was the highest peak in the Assyrian Empire? Was it the period of Ashurbanipal?
Yes, in the 7th century, that was it. And Ashurbanipal was the last really great king in like Queen Victoria or somebody like that. A very long reign with usually great stability, affluence, and power. And after him, there was a group of 1, 2, 3 rather less significant kings, and then that was it. Because the Elamites from Iran and the Babylonians from the south, they ganged up on Nineveh, and they were successful, and they invaded, and they conquered, they ran through the palace, they smashed everything, put all the ivories in the well, and the tablets that we have, most of them are broken probably from that time. So that was the end of a domination of the world that had lasted a very long time. And then it was gone. And then we had the Babylonian kings, and then the Persians, and then the Arabs, and then the modern world. So phases come and phases go. But in their day, I think Ashurbanipal was a king like you imagine an Oriental king, because, for example, downstairs when they're killing the lions, the king stands in his chariot, taller than everybody else, straight back. You know, there's a kind of quality of self-respect in his whole bearing. And he has a waistcoat or something, which is... he has a waistcoat which is embroidered with stars and things like that, carved in the sculpture, which must have been a really stunning piece of clothing. On the stone, it's just stone, but when you look with your eye, you look at it and you imagine it like dark red with gold on it or something. And you could see the sort of idea that you have from France in the Middle Ages, the King's War. Same idea.
They say some of the reliefs were colored, but because they got burned and
yes. Some of them were. It's possible with a scientific examination to see which parts of the sculpture were coloured and also what the colours were. But I don't think the famous sculptures were completely painted. I don't think that's right. I mean, because sometimes a bit of colour survives, but we don't know whether, for example, all the human figures were painted and the background not. We don't know. I think more research might answer this question. I'll tell you something interesting, however, that when the Assyrians produced a sculpture, a wall sculpture with a scene on it. So I'll tell you something interesting, that when the Assyrians carved the wall sculptures that we know from the palace, the decoration, they're cut very shallow, but very thin off the surface. They're not deeply engraved. And once we have made an experiment, because there's a good sculpture from Nineveh which shows an aqueduct built by King Sennacherib, the grandfather of Ashurbanipal, with columns of brick which brought water into Nineveh, because they always had to have a reliable water. Wells, and this aqueduct was a special thing. So this is carved in the stone. You have the loop, like a Victorian railway bridge, and landscape and trees and everything. And we tried an experiment. So we got a really good digital photograph of this sculpture. And then we coloured it in with the computer using common sense. So the sky was blue, the grass was green, and so forth. So it wasn't that we were very adventurous, and the plants were light green, dark green, and everything was coloured by this computer system, just to give an impression of what it would look like if it had been completely polychrome, had been completely coloured originally. And the interesting thing was, because we printed one out, was that the impact of the work was not a sculpture at all. You wouldn't even think of sculpture or the quality of the sculpture. It was simply a painting. It was just like an oil painting. And so if everything had been painted completely, it would look totally different from what we see today, because the stone is very beautiful. When it's illuminated, it seems somehow to be alive. And if you're clever with lighting, it's fantastic, the impact. And the aesthetic idea of modern scholars has to be based on the assumption that they were as they were then. But maybe they weren't. One thing is, if you look at the sculptures, you can see that people boot and ankle still have some colour. So the legs and the rest of the person not. And this is the reason that when the Assyrians, after the fall of Assyria and the palaces were abandoned, with what happened with nature and everything else, eventually the roof fell in and the walls and everything. And the idea is that the feet and ankles were the first thing to be covered when there was a collapse. So the colour there was preserved, and the other stuff, maybe the wind and the rain, and so by the time it was filled in, when it was to be excavated all the time afterwards, the colour had disappeared. So there's just a kind of bit along the bottom.
Thank you so much, Doctor, for your explanations. why the name Ashur was so common? Is it because of the city or the god?
It's because of the god. Ashur was an important god, and the capital, of course, was named after him. And many of the kings had Ashur as part, like Ashurbanipal, as part of the name, which means Ashur, the creator of my offspring, something like that. So, and that's why. So, Ashur, I mean, they had a large number of gods, a large number of important gods, and Ashur was the state god of Assyria. But in Babylonia, he wasn't so seriously revered. They had their own gods.
Because it's mentioned a lot, like as a god of gods, something like that.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
Well, that's right. There are different periods when they regarded one of the gods being the most important. Often it was Marduk, the Babylonian god, who became the first and most important god. Yeah. But Ashur too in Assyria was venerated as the chief god.
Were there any love story found in the cuneiform tablets?
Any love stories?
Love stories, yeah.
Well, let me think. There are different things. There are...
Maybe poems?
There are, yes, in Sumerian, which is the older language, there is kind of love poetry between Inanna, the goddess of love, and Dumuzi, her partner. And there are Sumerian texts where one speaks to the other in a loving and literary kind of way. So it's called their love poetry. And there are a small number of texts where men profess love for a woman and things like that. And also there's some rather rude love poetry, because in the about the 5th century, much after the Assyrian time in Babylonia, there was a kind of street theatre like we have in modern times, where actors portray the gods. And there's one in which Marduk, the chief god, and Sarpanitu, his wife, are portrayed. And Sarpanitu has a lover who's up on the roof. And the dialogue between them is obviously rather rude. I think it was the kind of, when they did it in the street, that all the men laughed a lot and all the women went red and they covered their children's ears so they didn't hear. So it was kind of that kind of love poetry of a special kind.
Do we see evidence of surgery or advanced medical practices on the cuneiform tablets?
Another interesting question. We have a lot of cuneiform tablets to do with healing, sickness and illness. Quite a lot. And they wrote down recipes and procedures for illnesses and diseases from head to foot. So they had them all systematically arranged. First one was head and the last one was foot. And in there's a very small amount of what you might call surgery. So they did a minor operation on the eye, and sometimes they use a scalpel once in a while, but not a lot, not a great deal, because I think my idea is this, that you had the intellectual traditional medicine in tablets, collected tablets, as a kind of encyclopedia. But the actual process of, if someone's leg's broken, making a thing so that it grows back, and if someone has an arrow through the middle, the scientific way of removing the arrow without making it worse and stitching up. The army, for certain, had what you would call today a military corps, people who went into battle, and the king probably had this idea, is he worth saving? Is it worth it, or just get rid of him like that? That sort of attitude. But it means that the people who worked in that unit, who handled that kind of unit, knew a great deal about the human body realistically, because they saw if someone is opened by a bull and their guts come out, they see they have a stomach and they have kidneys, and like animals that they butcher for eating, they knew a lot of things of this kind, but the knowledge of the inside of the body, which comes from that, is not on tablets. It's a separate and distinct, but it stands to reason. And there are lots of laws, for example, about responsibility. If a man is gored by a neighbour's bull, who's responsible for it? And if somebody is gored by a bull, they like this, everything comes out. And so you can imagine a dog, hey, just be quiet a minute. I say that's rather interesting. You know, they would do that. So they must have had, over the centuries, a lot of knowledge about what was inside the body, but they don't, on the whole, use it in the inscriptions, which collect therapeutic procedures.
What have you learned from the Library of Ashurbanipal?
Well, the Library of Ashurbanipal is a monument of great significance in the history of the world, because it tried to be complete and because we can read what's left. So it's like a magical email from Assyria. Open this carefully. This is all. This is what we have. So it's quite extraordinary. But the fact is, there were tablets and writing and scholarship and investigations long before and long after. So if you read cuneiform, you specialize in this kind of research. Then Nineveh is like a very bright light in a long story. And the long story is the thing which I think gives us more understanding than just that library. Because it's my conviction, having worked with this material since I was a teenager, that the people who lived in Syria and Babylonia, who used this writing system and lived their lives, were very, very similar to modern people. They weren't different from us. That's to say, their behavior, their motives, their psychology, their capacity to tell the truth and to tell lies and to be faithful and to be adulterers and to be savage and to be gentle, all the things that human beings can do in one person. So it was the same with them. And they are, so to speak, brothers across the period of time. They're not something that you look at with a telescope and you can't really understand because it's so long ago and they're so different. I don't think they are. So they look different. Their clothes are different. They believe in different gods. They eat different things, or they ate different things. Of course. But my idea is, if you're sitting on a coach going to work in Sydney with lots of people who live in Sydney, and all of a sudden a couple of Babylonians come on and sit in front of the seat in front of you, and they're wearing your kind of clothes, you wouldn't notice anything.
That's right.
You wouldn't notice. And people often think that the further back you go in time, the less evolved humanity is. That may be true, but it doesn't apply in the 5,000 years for which we have writing, because that's nothing in the history of the universe, 5,000 years. It's just nothing. So this is important, that these kids, that these people are like us, in my opinion. I think many people who are archaeologists and historians who study antiquity have the idea that the people in the past and the real past were not quite like we are. They were slightly different. They weren't quite as evolved as we are, that kind of thing. This is nonsense, because the 5,000 years during which writing existed is such a short period of time in the history of the world and evolution that it's a ridiculous proposition. And so I think it's true that the complexity of the modern person, where they can believe things that they know aren't true, and they can cope with this, and they can lie about that, all the things that people do with their human minds, so they did in antiquity. And that they are brothers to us. They are the same species as us, and what they did and what they wrote is intelligible to us. It's not bizarre.
Is it hard to learn cuneiform?
It depends on what languages you already know. If, for example, you know Arabic, or Hebrew, or Aramaic, or Syriac, modern languages of the Semitic family of languages, then if you decide to do an ancient Semitic language, this is a help, it's an advantage. And if you decide to learn Sumerian or Babylonian, Sumerian is not Semitic, but Babylonian is Semitic. So if you decide to learn one of those or both of those languages, there are two things you have to do. Firstly, you have to learn all the signs. And there's about 1,000 of them, and sometimes they have lots of different meanings. And then you have to learn the vocabulary and the grammar.
Okay.
So the vocabulary and grammar is what you learn if you do French and German at school.
That's right.
It's not you do that, but you also have to learn all the signs as well.
But
so
do you have
3
to
years. If
learn?
you want to know.
Sorry, do you have to learn Sumerian first because it was the first?
No, it doesn't matter.
Oh, it doesn't matter.
Most people do a bit of
Akkadian?
a bit of Akkadian, and then start Sumerian as well. But I had 3 years of teaching with a very brilliant professor who was very strict. So I worked very hard, and then I did a PhD, which was another 3 years, very strict. And at the end of it, I knew enough cuneiform to do this work for my living. So it's about 6 years, I think. And also, the important thing is start as soon as possible. I think children should begin learning cuneiform when they're 3 years old.
Can you share with us any interesting stories that you've read in cuneiform tablets that we haven't heard before?
Interesting stories. Yes, there is. There was a king of Babylon called Nebuchadnezzar. Very important and powerful king, and he had a son who succeeded him after his reign. And we know this son to be called Amel-Marduk. He wasn't a very powerful and effective king like his father, but he was king of Babylon for 2 or 3 years afterwards. In this museum, we have a kind of hymn which was written by Amel-Marduk when he was in prison, when Nebuchadnezzar, his father, was on the throne. And what had happened is that some people in the court had gone to the king and said, your son is plotting to overthrow you. He's a wicked person. There's a conspiracy and all this kind of thing. And Nebuchadnezzar took his son and threw him into prison. And this tablet that we have has on it a long and literary prayer in Babylonian language by this prince in prison to Marduk, the god of Babylon. And this is the thing. He writes in the most beautiful, fluent literary Babylonian that he's there by false witness, and that these people, their words are like the wind and they despise, and you must rescue me. And he says, if you rescue me, Marduk, from this prison, I will be your loyal servant for the remainder of my life. And what happened was that in due course he was released from prison, and we don't know what his name was when he was in prison. Because when you in Babylonia, you had a name as a boy, but when you became king, you adopted a throne name. So after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, he adopted the name Amel-Marduk. And the thing is that the poetry of it is some of our best poetry. It's very elevated, very elegant vocabulary and philosophically orientated. So you can imagine him in his cell with a clay tablet and a little water and a rat running up and down and writing this thing out. And it's come to us. We found it's in one of the tablets in the museum.
When Alexander the Great invented Babylon, did they took tablets with them back to Greece and translate them?
No, I don't think that Alexander did. It's unclear. But under the time of the Seleucids, when the Seleucids were in charge, we have scholars who came to Babylon from Greece, individuals And they came and studied in Babylon. They met their counterparts, some of whom were astronomers, some of whom were scholars of other things. And these Greeks studied with these Babylonians. So sometimes they learned some of the signs. And one of the things they did, because they were very good, the Greeks, at synthesizing data, they wanted data. And there were many tablets in Babylon with astronomical data in lists, the first and last visibility, for example, of such and such a phenomenon, listed in columns of numbers. And what the Greeks did is they learnt enough cuneiform to understand the numbers and to understand the days of the week and light and dark, and they transcribed them into the Greek writing system. So we have some papyri written in ink with Greek letters, which are a transcription of the Babylonian that we have excavated from Babylon, which is in the British Museum. So we can see that the Greek intelligentsia, the savants from Athens, went to Babylon to find out what they knew about astronomy. And the Babylonians didn't say, oh, you mind your own business, this is our knowledge, copyright, anything like that. They obviously opened the door
to them and
shared the information. And we know this because there are some small tablets with exercises for learning grammar with the Babylonian signs on the back in Greek letters. They transcribed the Greek letters so they could remember the signs. So we can see Greeks in the classroom on these small bits of stuff. So we are sure that that's the process, that they went there and they were warmly received and they took back with them information, and it all went on its beautiful history in the Greek mind and ever after.
They say Egypt were before Assyria, or Assyria before Egypt. Like, which civilization was born first?
Well, there is a kind of rivalry sometimes. Usually it's a joke rivalry, not a serious rivalry. But the origins of Egyptian culture and Babylonian culture go back millennia before writing. And the only issue which is relevant is whether Egyptian writing or cuneiform writing came first, because that is a kind of definable matter. And my own view is this, that Egypt and Mesopotamia, ancient Iraq, are not very far away from one another. And people did all sorts of things. They didn't just sit at home and wait for the end of time. And the thing is this, that the cuneiform writing and Egyptian writing look perfectly different one to the other. They look perfectly different. But it is possible to believe that hieroglyphic writing developed out of the idea of writing which they found in Mesopotamia, in cuneiform, and made up their own characters, their own letters, following this example. Once they seen it could be done, they made a homespun version. It's much easier to believe that principle than that Babylonians or Sumerians saw Egyptian writing and made up cuneiform. Psychologically, it's virtually impossible. So the one is derivative from the other. So I think probably that the beginnings of writing in Mesopotamia, in ancient Iraq, are older than in Egypt. But if you get an Egyptologist and ask them, they'll probably say just the opposite.
In ancient Assyria, did they believe that magic was a religion, or religion was magic?
In ancient Mesopotamia, what we call religion and what we call magic were quite separate. So religion, it's always very difficult with these simple words, but religion consisted of the knowledge of a great number of gods, big, medium and little. There were hundreds of deities. They all had temples. They all had family relationships, and they existed up there and they affected the world. And the gods on the whole were benevolent. they were on the side of human beings. Sometimes they forgot, sometimes they were careless. But magic, what we call magic, is the system of using words or procedures to affect change, to manipulate, for good or for evil, to drive out demons, to make somebody successful. These are uses of magic, with magic words, magic procedures, things you wear, things you eat. And really the two components are distinct. They are distinct. The only real connection between them is that the gods who are celebrated in religion, in the cult and in sacrifices and in the temples, the gods who ran everything, also had input into the magical world because they stood for light and goodness and benevolence. So spells call upon the gods to do this or to do that. And black magicians, evil magicians, wouldn't do that. They'd call on other forces. But really, if you try and make a comparison between magic with a big M and medicine with the big religion with the big R, it's very difficult to make a balanced judgment. They're kind of different.
In some reliefs, we see humans' body with wings, and they look like angels.
Yes, that's right.
Do you think the idea of angel came from these reliefs?
I think it would be very unlikely that there's a direct connection between these winged figures in Mesopotamia and the angels that we know in the medieval period and in religion.
Sorry to cut you off. Is there any scripts that explain why did they carve like human with wings?
There are no secrets that we know about it. What we have is what we see, and what we see is what we have. But they are divine, and the wings are put on the bulls as a kind of attribute, as a kind of, to show that they are divine. They're not actual bulls, they are bulls on a different level. But I think it's a difficult matter to try and link A to B as if it's with a ruler between them, because there's a very long history for the idea that gods had wings in many cultures, and what fed into the angelology of later times is probably much more complicated than taking, say, an Assyrian thing and saying that's the ancestor of it.
With hunting lions, was it ritual thing? Like, do the king has to do it before he come like to the throne, or?
Well, my idea about the lion reliefs is not what everybody believes. I don't think they were hunted. I think they were ceremoniously killed, because if you look on the reliefs, the lions are brought in cages to the place where the king with the chariot and the horsemen and everyone are waiting, and the lions come out in a cage, and then a boy lifts up the door and out comes the lion. And if you have a lion in a small cage and you open the door, the lion is going to spring out like that.
That's right.
But it doesn't. It comes out slowly. And then it sees that the lionesses in front of it are dead. They've been shot with arrows. And I think this is what happened, that they bred the lions at Nineveh. They were more or less tame. There are lions walking about the garden. And when they had one of these rituals once a year where they had to kill one lion for each of the 12 gates of Nineveh, they had the lions, they had the archers, they had the soldiers and everything like this already. But they had to make the lions furious. So they killed the women, so to speak, the lionesses, and they shot them, so that and then they leapt up on the chariot with like that, and so the king could dispatch them with a through the throat.
Okay.
And if you look carefully, you can see that the king had to be the killer, because there are two tall guys next to him with very long lances, and they can keep the lion back, but they mustn't kill it. And the king is the one who does it. So it was a kind of, it was like a ritual in the sense, like a ballet. It was orchestrated. And I think everybody watched from all around the walls and cheered and everything. And they made offerings of bits of it to the goddess on an altar. And there were one for each of the gates. And probably they did it once a year. I'm not absolutely certain. So it's more like a bullfight in the modern world, or something like that.
Can you tell me some words from ancient Mesopotamia? Like, I want to hear the words.
Okay, father is Abu. Mother is Ummu. The word for earth is Ertsetu. The word for water is Mu, with a long U. Let me think. A dog is Kalbu. What else is going to be cognate? House is Bitu, like bite.
We say beta as well, so see.
It's the same thing. Tree is Itsu. It's difficult to think of words which... we need words which are the same in Arabic. You should have asked me to make a list.
Lately, they found a huge winged bull in Nineveh, 6 meter long. Lately, they just announced it in Iraq.
And was it complete?
No, it was, I think, pieces. Yeah.
And with an inscription also?
Not sure, not quite sure, but they just announced it like a month ago.
You see, there's always things to be found. This is true.
Do you think there will be more winged bulls to be found?
Yes. I think probably most of the tablets ever written are still in the earth in Iraq. Thousands and thousands of them. Depends who finds them.
They say there's only 5% that been, decoded.
Or altogether, or in this museum?
Altogether, maybe. I'm not quite sure, but like it's a low percentage.
Well, it's low, but it's not. This is the situation. We have about 130,000 tablets here
in this museum. In British Museum.
British Museum, and they cover about 3,000 years of time, a bit more than 3,000 years of time, and they're all. We know something about all of them. That's to say, when they are here, they're given a number and a description is written down. And with the passage of time, increasingly, individual tablets become published. And for many years, people would write books or articles and things would appear. But with the modern world and the digital facility, it has become possible to accelerate this process very drastically. So there are specialist photographers who take digital photographs. For example, all the tablets from Ashurbanipal's library have been done by this process, photographed front and back and the sides if there's writing, digital photographs which are made available to anybody who wants to read them. So it means that the resources are much more accessible for people. They don't have to come to the British Museum, which is very expensive in hotels and travel and everything. They can sit at home and work on their computer screens on the documents. So there's been a big advance in the facility, but there hasn't been a big advance in the number of people who do the work. And that, of course, is important because you need lots of students to become Assyriologists and work with these tablets. And it's always been a rather small field with not many young people deciding that's their life's work.
Is there any scripts that have been written by Ashurbanipal himself?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, there are. When he had this teacher, Balasi, there's a hymn written by Ashurbanipal in his best writing, and it's rather big script. And Balassi must have set him this as a piece of work. And then when it was given to him by the crown prince, it must have been a strange thing, because the signs are beautiful, but what the boy didn't do was to join the letters. Because when you write cuneiform with your stylus on the clay, the signs flow like this. So when you've written a sign, the end of one sign should just touch the next one, so that it's kind of like that. It moves like, and he did this sign space, this sign space.
Okay.
And I always imagine that Balassi must have thought that the calligraphy is really good and the work, but it's so funny, it's so comical that he did this. And maybe he laughed, maybe Ashurbanipal was offended, but they never threw it away. They kept it in the library, which I think must be that he probably was about 7 or 8 when he did it. And they kept it as part of the library, and so we know it. So
is there any stories about his daily life, or in Nineveh in general, like their daily life?
Well, I think the daily life of a king is different from most people. I mean, the majority of the population worked outside of the city on farms and on the rivers and people of this kind, and they got up with the sun and went to bed when it was dark, and that was that. But I think life in the court was, for Ashurbanipal, he had female partners. He had a queen, he had lots of children. We don't know exactly how many, but things would happen all the time because traders might come with something very exotic that they wanted the king to purchase. Then ambassadors would come to report on what's happened, and the king might be very pleased and give them something from his, and he might be very angry. What have you done? What have you done? This is, and shout at them and walk up and down. And then there'd be people like the generals who talking about the campaign and what the people who take the omens, the diviners, say, about this big campaign. They have to, if they're going to go in and invade, they have to have animals and livestock and food and water access and all the things like an army has to have. And the generals who worked for Ashurbanipal were like generals. They took responsibility, and they must have had to report to the king and discuss how to deal with difficulties and all these kind of things. And I imagine he had many meetings, and sometimes someone who had been rebellious was taken to Nineveh, and their ears were cut off and their tongue was cut out, and the king thrown in front of the king for justice. And so he probably had a full day.
Queen Samuramat.
Yes.
Is it a myth or real?
There was a queen called Samuramat, an Assyrian queen, and at about the same time, and she must have been a woman of some individuality and impact. There's a belief that Sennacherib was rather he had a liberal attitude to women. Something like that. So she was quite famous, Samuramat. Yeah. And then when the Greeks were writing down what they knew about Babylonia in later times, they recorded all the stories they could get their hands on. And this Samuramat obviously appealed, because women in history who are famous and effective are always very rare. And she was called Semiramis in Greek.
Semiramis, that's right.
But what they wrote about her is probably not, should we say, historically very accurate, but it's the same character as you might say being reborn later, something like that.
Yep. Dr. Irving Finkel, thank you so much for your time.
It's a pleasure.
We really
I'm glad you came to here. I'm glad you came here to see us and that we could discuss things together.
Thank you so much. It's a dream that came true for me personally, and I would like to thank British Museum for this opportunity and all the staff that worked so hard to make this happen, Pepe, Olivia, and everyone else. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Dr. Irving Finkel. Thank you so much.
Bravo.
Thank you.